Alright, let's make another video. I do apologize for this one being a late upload. I'll get into the habit of scheduling these things, hopefully, so you don't have to receive them all late at night, but we will see. For this one, let's talk about convincing people in an argument. Now, in arguments, how or even if you can convince someone really depends on the person and the beliefs in question. For example, you're not going to find a debate bro suddenly just giving up and saying, yes, I agree with you. No, you're going to find an ideologue doing the same. And of course, to what extent depends on how much they believe it and what ideologies in question they do believe, because certain beliefs do have a sort of dogmatism to them. For example, Marxism requires the adoption of certain beliefs and a certain way of looking at the world. And so, if you look at the world through a Marxist perspective, you're going to come to the conclusion of Marxism. That's just fairly logical, so you're not really going to be able to convince a Marxist off that point unless you break the entire principle of Marxist material dialectics. But there are still a few general actions that can be taken to further one side in a debate. The biggest one is not falling for fallacies. You can engage with them to some degree, but you must maintain focus on the argument at hand and not all the poor reasoning used to portray it. Some common ones include ad hominems, of course red herrings, and Mon Baileys, along with several others. But it's sometimes good to address them. For example, with a Gish Gallop, it's sometimes good to address a few things and say, I can't address all of them at this time, but 1, 2, I can address these. And say, alright, there's that. Now, back to your main point, here's the issues with it. Now, of course, sometimes that can be unreliable because, again, with things like the Gish Gallop, it relies on you not addressing everything. But at the very least, you can address some of it, and the important thing is it can lead in to a larger point. For example, if someone's trying to argue that the Earth is flat, and so they bring up all these things, and you address two of them, you can then use them to make a further point. For example, with gravity. Why does gravity work like this? Wouldn't it work like this? You can correct that and say, no, it works like this because things are doing this. And bring it to the main point of, if the Earth was flat, then how come we have things as they are, which only make sense in a flat, not in a flat, in a round world? For example, you have seasons that vary depending on location. Winter for someone in Alaska is summer for someone in Argentina. That only makes sense in a spherical globe where things are flipped. But then, how would your gravity make sense then? Well, clearly, if it's flat, that wouldn't happen, and so gravity must work by pulling things inwards, which is exactly what it does. It pulls you closer to the core, which, because we got something solid in between, can't exactly go that far. If you literally dug a hole straight to the core, you'd just fall until you hit it, or died beforehand. There's really no other way that goes. And so you can use someone's own fallacies against them by using it to direct a main point. And that's a big thing I would like to add following that. Do not retreat from a position just because you are tested, but only if wrong. And in such cases, it's often best to reposition and adapt. For example, let's talk about funding. Let's say you're arguing about how the federal government spends money. A lot of people do it. Frankly, it's fairly obvious why people have issues. And you say, hey, we didn't spend money on this, we spent money on that. And it turns out, they actually did spend money on the thing you thought wasn't, getting money. It's the government. That happens all the freaking time. Instead of denying it outright, which is a very bad habit, say, okay, I was wrong, I'm sorry, but that does not change my position, it just means I was wrong in that one point. Reposition. Accept that one thing is right, adapt, and then attack on something else. For example, just because you were wrong about, say, $5 billion being spent on a certain project does not mean that suddenly your main point about us spending hundreds of billions on something else is a bad idea. You can do it for basically anything, really. But that's the big thing. If you're wrong, adapt and adjust. Don't deny it outright unless you know it is false. But if you know it is false, then do not retreat. Because if you retreat, then that is caving into your opponent and acknowledging their correctness on something which you know to be false. And it is bad to give such an impression. So if you attest on something, reposition if wrong. That's just a guaranteed thing. You do not want to be caught in a lie because that makes you look bad and makes your argument less convincing. And if we're talking about out of debate, not trying to convince people, it's just a good thing to have a belief system that is correct on such things, and to outright deny things just because they're inconvenient is a very bad habit. But when you test it and you think, at the very least, that you can prove something wrong, do try to do so. Use what evidence you have to do it, and argue your points as best you can. Because fundamentally, if you retreat, you are giving your enemy ground they will use. And while you don't always need sources, for example, a lot of YouTube comment debates don't really have a lot of sources, people just say things. While they do help, they're not necessarily required. Having something to reference is very useful when pinning an opponent's argument and addressing it. For example, talking about the budget. It's this common thing that people talk about of, oh, we spend like half of our budget on the military in the US. No, we don't. We spend quite a bit of money, yes, but not half. In fact, we actually spend more money on Social Security than the military, and I can easily bring up the Congressional Budget Office, which keeps regular track of these things annually, and point to that and say the 2024 or the 2025 Congressional Budget Office report, which states our government's budget, proves that to be false. That is very good, and it helps. Not only for an honest debate, because someone can fact-check you, but also it pins your argument, or rather pins your opponent's argument and makes them have to adjust themselves. They're put in a position where they are effectively defenseless. Because unless they know something else which counters your beliefs, well, then guess what? They're kind of stuck. And they can't really wiggle their way out of it, because if your entire basis for something is something that's simply not true, well, then you're not going to have an easy time defending it. And so it effectively allows you to pin the opponent's argument and force them to address it. Either they address it, and you can prove them wrong with evidence, or just words if you know how to argue things with reason, or they retreat, and that gives you a huge advantage. Since if they're wrong about one thing, you can push it for others, and essentially build a cascade effect of, your beliefs relied on this, if this is false, then this thing which comes out of it is also false, and so on and so forth. If you can pin one argument, you can break it, and then use it to break others. And following that up, if an opponent holds an untenable position, assault it. If they seek to argue a falsehood, challenge it and then see if it is useful to frame the argument as if the falsehood were true. Okay, let's use back to the example with the budget. If someone's going to make the argument of the US spends so-and-so percentage of money on its military, and it's false, challenge that. Use your evidence if you can. Break it. And make them be forced to address the incorrectness of their own statements. And use that untenable position to basically push you further in the argument. And it can oftentimes still be very useful to frame the argument as if the falsehood were true. For example, let's use the idea of the United States spending half of its budget on the military. Okay, let's say someone actually makes that argument. Now you can break that argument and show that it's not the case. But here's the fun part. If your argument is that, say, spending in another sector is still wasteful, then you can say, okay, let's say it's true, right? Half our budget spent on the military. A lot of money, right? But if we're still spending all this money on this thing, and it's not helping us, well, then that's still wasteful, right? It doesn't matter if we're spending 50% on the military if that thing's still bad, does it? It allows you to effectively tell your opponent, 1, you're wrong, 2, even if you were right, I would still be correct for pointing out this flaw, and 3, it forces them back to a point where they have to defend their main ideas. And of course, with that comes their principles and main beliefs. And if your opponent relies on a principle or is knowingly using the debate to justify something else, target that. And if wrong on said principle or justification, adjust and return back to the initial argument. Let's use gun control as an example here. A common thing that you'll see with people who argue for gun control is arguing that the Constitution is flexible. This is largely because, well, one, it's convenient for them, and two, the idea that it's up for interpretation allows for people to avoid the Second Amendment, which is very inconvenient for anyone who seeks to argue for gun control, since if we're following a strict constitutionalist perspective, there can be no gun control allowed. Because, for those who don't know the full quote, the full Second Amendment is... Let me actually pull up my Constitution since I have one. Now, I got this book, The Constitution and Other Patriotic Documents. Here's the source. I'm going to try to quote it from memory. So, let's see if I can quote it properly. Now, I do apologize if you don't believe me, but well-regulated militia, being necessary for a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Let's see. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Amendment number 2, 1791, Bill of Rights, Constitution of the United States of America. I was flipping them in my head for some reason and wanted to say the free part before the well-regulated militia part, which is not true. Now, the reason I bring this up is because if you're going to argue for gun control, it is quite common to argue that there is leniency to the Constitution itself, because naturally speaking, without that leniency, you can't really make such an argument, since the Second Amendment is very clear about the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And so if you notice that, for example, someone's arguing against free speech or gun rights on the basis of the Constitution being a living document, you can basically head it off at the pass. If you recognize that's where things are going, because say it started with a debate on the Second Amendment or something else, and you realize this person is doing this to argue whatever point, then you can essentially head it off and pass and say, no, that is incorrect, here's why. Even if they haven't fully gone to that point yet. And if it's a principle, like someone arguing for something on the basis of equality, and you believe that they are, you can say, are you doing this because people are equal? And if so, yada yada yada, this belief in equality does not apply to this or does not work. And if you're wrong, sometimes you legitimately are just wrong. In such a case, withdraw and say, hey, people tend to use this to argue this point. I was heading it off. I didn't realize that's not what you're referring to. I do apologize. Let's get back to the original point. This allows a fair way to retreat without making your position untenable, because you're still acknowledging the opponent's original point. And if they do say, that's not what I was talking about, and then later veer off into that exact thing, well then, plausible deniability for you, and they absolutely do not have the same on their end. And since you've already addressed it, you can just repeat your own points or remind them of the previous points made. It's very effective. At the very least, good at pinning things down when you see where certain things are going. But if you know something outright, if you know a principle is being argued, or know that someone is using the debate to justify something, and you have evidence to prove against it, that say the position is wrong or that what they believe about it would be incorrect, then use it. Argue against it. Break that original point. And especially if that thing stands on shaky ground and it's the basis for a position, attack it. Attack it hard. Because here's the thing. A Mott and a Bailey are quite effective fallacious arguments to make. Why? Because it's very easy to defend the Mott when you can't defend the Bailey. Or I think I might be mixing them up. Regardless. One's far easier to defend than the other. If I got it backwards, I do apologize. But, given that, attacking the harder to defend one is very useful. For example, what if I were to tell you that most of the Nordic states have a lower GDP per capita than the US? A lot of people try to use the Nordic countries to argue that they're better economically than the US, and that we should pursue socialism or things similar to socialism because of the Nordic countries. But if you point that out, alongside other factors like the fact that the Nordic countries are actually fairly pro-business, it's honestly quite impressive that they are not the socialist havens a lot of people on the left like to paint them as, well then, you can effectively break the thing that they're trying to hide behind. This idea of, I don't support these policies because I'm a socialist, or democratic, socialist, communist, whatever, but rather because, hey, there are some good outcomes that can come of it. If it's just blatantly not true, well then you can break the solid backing that their argument has and put them in an untenable position. Because if the thing they were going to retreat to can't be held, and the thing they're currently holding is far less defensive, say a person arguing for actual Stalinism, well then, there goes most of their argument. And even if you're not able to convince them, the people who are listening to both of you, watching both of you, they can be convinced, and they can be turned away from your opponent. And that is very useful. You should attack the Mott and the Bailey, not just one. And you shouldn't let your opponent just retreat without attacking it. Because, fundamentally, if that inner defense can be broken, their argument can break completely. And by extension, their argument can be defeated and you can win. The Mott and Bailey is useful because it is defensive. It's far easier to hold one position than another, and so you have to put in less work to do so. That, of course, makes it far harder to attack, which is not good, but it's still possible to do so. And if it's possible, do take advantage of it. Because fundamentally, your opponent will rely on something to back something up. When you're talking about economic policy, you are fundamentally talking about things like scarcity, quality of life, human betterment, production of wealth. You are talking about things like that. And your opponent is going to use such things to back up their position. Hey, these people here who follow my economic beliefs achieve these results that were good for insert thing here. That's what they're going to argue, and it makes sense because that's the goal. If you can agree that the goal is to achieve X, and your opponent says, yes, X is what we want, then both people will be arguing on the basis of X. And if you can shatter the belief that their position helps further X, then you can just break their argument. Their points become null because, well, if they're incorrect, they're just flat out incorrect. And so their way of pursuing things would be wrong, even if you wish to acknowledge that certain points are true. For example, the US does spend a lot more on healthcare than most of Europe. That much is true. But if you can prove that public healthcare or a single-payer system does not help that, which there can be arguments made for that, I haven't done as much research into it, so I can't make as much, but I am sure plenty of people could argue both for and against. In such a case, if you can break that the single payer would help with that problem, then fundamentally, you are breaking the position of a person arguing for it. Since if it doesn't solve the problems caused by a current system, then the new system should not be pursued. Especially if it creates far more problems that our current system does not have. And so that's how you get to an argument, specifically to a winning position in one. It's easy to attack an outlying position, those extreme positions on the fray of a person and their beliefs. I, for example, am an imperialist. Fairly easy to attack me there. And I don't deny it. Will I defend my points? Yes. But it's a lot easier to argue on that point than many others. But if you want to really destroy a position, you hit beyond the fringes. You attack their baselines, those things they take for granted. Because if you can break that, then you have a far better shot of convincing them. If those main principles, those main ideas that they have to justify their other beliefs, even those on the fringes, if you can break that, you can convince them, at least most people, to change what they believe. And in such cases where you can't, you can convince their audience, those listening, to change. And that comes with many benefits. Let's face it, winning an argument feels good. There's that obvious one, but also, it makes people more likely to support your positions. And supporting your positions helps a lot, especially in Republican nations and states which naturally like to defer to voting. Even if it's not the most efficient method, it's still the method people choose, and as such, it's a lot easier to convince people. In the United States, you want to do something? Ask people, and some may well just say, alright, let's vote on it. It's a common way to just break a tie, even if someone's a connoisseur and knows what to do. Sometimes people just want to vote on things, and this is true in our governments as well. And so if you can take that person who is going to vote for X because they believe they're right, and prove that their position on X is fundamentally inaccurate and that Y is actually better to vote for, well then, that helps you, doesn't it? That's one more vote for you, one less vote for X, and it's far harder to cheat because guess what? Now they got more votes to overcome. So fundamentally, it's a win. Convincing is very useful in debate, and it should be acknowledged. Of course, many people do at least acknowledge it to some degree, but especially in the modern era with a lot of debate bros and people just doing things for clicks, you naturally have some issues with it where people are basically just going for sound bites. It's one thing to get a sound bite. Those can help get people to laugh, maybe look at something and say, wow, that idiot, how could they possibly believe such a thing? It's another thing to actually convince them. Convincing is how you win things in the long term. A soundbite may be good for those who already believe your positions. They may hurt a few people who disagree. But convincing people is how you win the long game. Even if just by getting them out of your way and not willing to argue against you because they don't believe they have a good argument for it. Some people argue anyways, but that's just life. People are people. But even just getting one person to the sidelines, one person not standing against you, is beneficial. And it should not be forgotten. We want to convince, not just entertain, not just create debates and arguments. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.